Gnome rat. That's the word I couldn't remember before. Gnome rats. Those were the weird golem-like creatures that lived in the Terra mines. Particularly one named Gundera, who was the one who left all sorts of weird messages on the website. And you would click to find the various clues and messages there. But be careful, you click the wrong one in that area of the website, and you'll find one of the best jump scares on the website that year. It was fun. Okay, so the gnome rats were in the Terra mines. Now the Terra mines had a unique trick. This was the first time they did this at Halloween Horror Nights, and it worked pretty effectively that year. They did it again a few years later, not so good. Basically, the idea was every 10th person or so got to wear a helmet, and the helmet had a light on it, you see. And some parts of the house were very, very dark, and the only illumination came from that light on the helmet. What's more, there seemed to be sensory devices through the run of the house where the light may go on or off, or maybe turn red or green, but sometimes it would turn off completely and then turn back on again just when something was going to jump out and scare you. Of course, it had its limitations. It worked pretty well if you were the one lucky enough to wear the helmet or you were close to that person, but if you were further away from that person, you might not enjoy the house so much. I went through a couple of times that year, and I rather liked it. I thought it was cool, and I must have been lucky enough for good timing, and I actually did get to wear the helmet, so that probably helped my enjoyment of that particular house. Alright, so that was Terra Mines. Now we come to Blood Ruins. This was the house that was originally going to be presented in the Dueling Dragons queue area. It's rather unfortunate that it wasn't, because it probably would have been a much better house if it had been. The consensus of people who attended that year, Blood Ruins was probably the least appreciated house of the year. In fact, it's considered by some people to be one of the worst houses in the history of Halloween Horror Nights. I'm not sure I would go quite that far. But, you know, because I think it was head and shoulders above another house that same year, and some other houses they've had in years before that, and well, maybe since. Basically, I think it was unappreciated because it wasn't quite as evocative as some of the other houses in the storyline of Terra Cuentes. Basically, you went through a medieval torture chamber. The Blood Ruins is where some evil monks who worshipped the Queen would torture victims who were unworthy. You see, this was one of 3 houses that you would enter through the Hallows, that is Seuss Landing, where the entranceways to the soundstage houses were located. The Blood Ruins was in Soundstage 22, actually, which of course is actually over in the other park, that is in Universal Studios Florida, but every time they had it at Islands of Adventure, they would still use the sound stages, and so you had to go through one of those little passes or passageways that would take you over there. This time, rather than having a neat scare zone like they did the previous year to get there, you went through this area that was sort of a festival or carnival or fair, which was called Medalkin Pass. Supposedly this was the pass through the mountains to get to some certain places where you would be tested to see if you were worthy. Now, those who were unworthy would die in those houses, not passing the test. Those who were worthy and proven to be pure of heart would then be sacrificed by the Queen. So you're fucked either way. Ha ha ha. Anyway, when you went into the Terra Mines, basically, I mean into the Blood Ruins, the idea was in this ruined abbey or wherever it was, where the monks were, victims who were not worthy were being horribly butchered and tortured in nasty ways. So you had these evil monks running around in their robes and hoods, and a bunch of victims being tortured in various torture chambers. That was about it, really. And so wasn't that bad, but basically some people didn't find it very as exciting as some of the other houses. The next house, though, I think was far worse than Blood Ruins. This is the house I would nominate as the worst house of the year. It was in Soundstage 18. In fact, this was an odd year, 15. Usually your soundstage houses are some of the best houses of the year because you have all that room to build something elaborate. And yet, oddly enough, it was these three soundstage houses that were not quite as effective as some of the other houses. Possibly because Body Collectors and Demon Cantata were so awesome, and the Terra Mines had such a neat effect and a novelty to it, that the three soundstage houses seem lackluster by comparison. But Cold Blind Terror was really lackluster. It was originally, of course, designed for the concept of darkness, and the idea was you're in total darkness and it's freezing cold. Of course, the problem was, one, you were never in total darkness. It was dim lighting at best, but especially if you go in at night, you could pretty much see where you're going, and it was never quite that cold in there. There really wasn't Cold Blind Terror whatsoever. I honestly don't remember very much about the characters in that house. There was a lot of fog to try to make you not being able to see. I think they tried to import some fog in there, and there were people lurching about and stuff. But for some reason, this house was so lackluster that I have no real clear memories of it. It just didn't impress my memory enough to remember the scenes in any great detail. But really, it is considered by many people to be one of the most lackluster and probably one of the worst houses of the entire history of Halloween Horror Nights. So, oddly enough, there were some really dull houses as well as some awesome houses that year, which is kind of odd that this happened in the same year, but yeah. The final house, Where Evil Hides, wasn't that bad of a house, but many people don't like it either. I think because it, again, was too much like some other houses in previous years. Again, that was supposed to be a house that would fit in with the darkness theme, where you would have, the whole idea there's something under your bed, there's something in the closet, in the attic, or in the basement with something dark and scary. It was kind of a boogeyman house, basically. And oddly enough, the boogeyman was Michael Myers, basically. He looked just like Michael Myers, except it wasn't, because he had the brand of Terra cuentes on his mask. But he would come out and attack you like the boogeyman. Also, this is where they stuck the storyteller. You went into what was essentially a house, a little suburban house somewhere, the facade. Again, the different places in Terra cuentes occurred in different time zones simultaneously. You had the 30s in the Ironbone Gorge, Gorewood Forest. The school seemed to be in the early 20th century, somewhere like maybe in the early part of the century. The Body Collectors looked very Victorian in their appearance and style. That could be like from the 1900s. In their way. The Blood Ruins was clearly in the Middle Ages, and this one was in modern times. So you were in a very contemporary house, but it was all ruined and falling apart like a haunted house. And when you went in there, it was like a modern day house, but of course one that had been abandoned and was haunted by this boogeyman. And of course the storyteller also appeared there, sitting in her chair with her book and warning you to be good or whatever, and was the only appearance of the storyteller in the park, basically. So there she was, stuck in this house, which had originally been designed for darkness. In fact, the whole thing, all the houses have originally been a part of the darkness scenario, but they have been adapted, of course, into Terra cuentes. That was Where Evil Hides. So those were the 7 haunted houses that year. They had 4 scare zones that year, and I've talked briefly about some of them, but now go into more detail. As I said, each place in each of the islands, again, were sort of transformed into a separate part of Terra cuentes. And so Port of Evil became the Terra Throne area, the Terra Gate. You went through the Terra Gate, and you went through this, which is filled with the minions of the Queen. There were great, huge structures featuring these skulls of the, with like a cattle skull on a huge tall body. If you went last year, there were a couple of these on Hollywood Boulevard from that year. These big, tall edifices, these sort of statue-like things. And then you also had various characters that were minions of the Queen lurking about. The most notable was Eelmouth, who apparently was the royal herald of the Queen, a strange, evil sorcerer-type figure whose face was like corroded and like his, there was like his mouth went up and it was his, his teeth were exposed, a big hole in his face with a flap of skin coming down over it, sort of like Jonah Hex. If Jonah Hex had lived in the Middle Ages, and he was there telling people the Queen is coming and all of this, and in the big Gore throne, the Gorewood throne, the Gorewood tree, which was actually big, huge pieces of petrified wood that had turned into metal, and coming up around the throne where the Queen would sit, and where she would sacrifice victims at various times. And this was actually the Terra Gate. And the first scare zone was in this area. It was called Terra Guard Run. And so the guards at the Queen, including those on motorcycles, and the Queen herself would ride a motorcycle, and the various minions would be the characters there. Going into Marvel Superhero Island, this was, of course, the domain of the demons, who also rode about on motorcycles. This was Blood Thunder Alley. And so that was the scare zone in that area, which I said had a sort of a 1930s feel to it. Although you had these demons who looked like something out of Mad Max, From Dusk Till Dawn, barbarian, demon, biker, mutant freaks riding around there quite a bit. The Hollows didn't have any scare zones. Essentially they were like the dark areas of the park that were kind of themed up to Terra Cuentes in a way, especially Seuss Landing, which could not be used, and Toon Laguna as well. But when you got to Jurassic Park, that became Gorewood Forest, and the cemetery mines, of course, because they planted cemetery mines. How can it be a mine? Well, you put the bodies in, then you mine the iron out later. And so you had all these little structures that are like the entranceways to mines, planted all over the Jurassic Park, which was Gorewood Forest, with the trees and everything and all the growth. And out of these things would come at times these horrific beasts, some of the most awesome characters, because they made quadrupeds out of people, and they made these huge, awesome, like demon dogs from hell, creatures with big glowing eyes that would come leaping out of these little structures, and these are called knuckle grunts. They were truly amazing. You never knew when one was going to come out of one of those things, if there was one in there or not. And that was one of my favorite areas in that part. The other remaining scare zone was in the Lost Continent, which became the medieval town of the Dragon Forge, where they actually forged the blade. And of course you had your chainsaw drill team there, as these medieval orc-like creatures running around, as well as other demonic creatures that you might meet in the Middle Ages in what was called the fire pits. And of course there was fire and other devices there to create that whole effect. So those were the scare zones themed to Terra Cuentes. Alright, now let's go on to the shows. There were 2 shows in Halloween Horror Nights that year, and the first show was one I've already alluded to, which was the Terra Throne. When you got up to the Terra Throne, they had a special show there presented several times during the evening. Terra Queen would arrive on her motorcycle, and she would call for sacrifice. The whole backstory was, again, the sacrificial victims were sacrificed there with the blade. Okay, when they were sacrificed, the demons would then take the bodies and remains of these victims, the demons from Ironbone Gorge, would then take them up to Gorewood Forest. There, they would be carefully dismembered in horrible ways by the body collectors, and the blood would be saved and taken to Dragon Forge. The flesh, I suppose, was consumed by demons at the Cantina or other places, and eaten and feasted upon, and part of the celebrations of the season of the Queen. But the bones were buried in the earth in the cemetery mines of Gorewood Forest. They were dug up after a time when they transformed into iron. They also, the blood fed the gorewood tree, and so the wood of the tree turned into iron, the bodies turned into iron, and this iron was then used to make the blade, because the blade was constantly being recreated again and again. And so, oh, I'm running out of time.